This is Agriculture Today. I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. Ahead of us today on this Wednesday's program, we start with Roger McEowen of K-State and Washburn University School of Law. He joins us for this week's agricultural law update and provides listeners with information on the latest IRS modification to the Portability Election Rule. Also ahead, we have K-State southeastern area agronomist Bruno Pedreira. He shares the importance of soil testing in regards to forage production specifically, with a focus on costs and efficiency. We end this Wednesday's program with the Beef Cattle Institute's Ask the Experts segment, where this week's experts, Brad White, Brian Lubbers, Dustin Pendell, and Phillip Lancaster, share their thoughts on hopes for improving beef cattle genetics. That and more awaits us ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are back now with Roger McEowen for our bi-monthly ag law update. So Roger from K-State and Washburn University School of Law, he's going to be supplying us with that information today. So Roger, thanks for joining us.
It's always good to be with you.
Well, let's start off with this first story that you've recently wrote about. The IRS has recently modified a portability election rule. Can you explain a little bit of that modification for us?
Yeah, this has to do with federal estate tax. And a number of years ago, back in 2010, there was a law that was passed that said for decedents' estates and for deaths after 2010, so starting in 2011, that we had this new concept that we had never had before with respect to the estate tax, and it was known as portability. And what that does is for a married couple, if you have any unused federal estate tax exemption equivalent amount at the death of the first spouse, you can port that over, transfer it over to the surviving spouse, and they can add it to their exemption. And that's a big deal. The current level of the Unified Credit Exemption equivalent is $12.06 million for deaths or gifts made in 2022. And that's per person. So in a married couple, the husband has his $12.06 million exemption amount from federal estate tax. The wife has her $12.06 million. So over both of their deaths, under current law, there's $24.12 million that can be shielded from federal estate tax. So there are really very few estates. It's a fraction of 1%, Samantha, of all decedents' estates that are actually subject to federal estate tax. When it applies, it's a big deal. But that amount is set to come down to $5 million adjusted for inflation in 2011 dollars, starting in 2026. So the ability to port over any unused amount of the exemption for a smaller estate to a surviving spouse is really a big deal. And just to put some numbers on that, let's say that I've got a farm or ranch operation Kansas, and it's worth $5 million, and there are a lot in that category. Well, there's no federal estate tax liability under current law because the exemption is $12.06 million per decedent, per spouse. But what if that exemption level comes back down to $5 million in 2026, and now your values have gone up to $7 million? Well, you've got that extra $2 million that would be taxed at 40%. So that's a really big chunk. Mm-hmm. Well, if I can take any exemption that I left on the table at the death of the first spouse and transfer that to the surviving spouse, I may be able to eliminate the tax on that $2 million of excess value at the death of the surviving spouse. That's why this is a pretty big deal.
Absolutely, and I think you also highlighted why it's a big deal because we talk about the cost of farmland going up every year, and we can only anticipate that to continue really from here, right?
That and asset values in general. And if you take a farm or a ranch that is uniquely positioned on the edge of an urban area, mm-hmm. Say around Wichita and the Kansas City area, even around areas such as Topeka or any type of urban area, we could see this impact even in areas out near Salina in central Kansas. You would price pressure put on that land because of developmental potential. And so that gets reflected in your estate tax value. Now, there are some other things that we can do from a planning standpoint to deal with that type of situation. But if you don't take those steps, then you've got that increased value, let alone from what the ag land market is doing. So, yeah, land values could go up, and if Congress lets the law stay where it is right now, that exemption's got to come down, and could see more estates that are subjected to federal estate tax in the future. That's why portability is really important. And for the estates that don't have to file a federal estate tax return because there's no tax, they can make this portability election by filing a 706, a Form 706, which is the estate tax return in the estate of the first spouse to die, check a box, fill out some other paperwork associated with that return, and port that over or transfer that unused amount so that the surviving spouse can add it on to his or her own amount.
Sure. And before this rule was like a 2-year period that you had to do this, right? And they've changed that to now where it's going to be 5 years?
Yeah, that was the recent announcement by IRS just less than a couple of weeks ago. Yes, there was a 2-year rule that was set forth from the date of the death of the first spouse to make that portability election in that first spouse's estate. And IRS has now extended that to 5 years from the date of death of the first spouse. I think they did that for a couple of reasons. One is they're extremely understaffed in the estate and gift tax area. And if you're dealing with all of these small estates needing to make a portability election, you simply can't keep up with the processing of it, let alone income tax returns that they're woefully behind on processing. They're streamlined, but still there's a lot of confusion amongst taxpayers as to how these rules actually work. So they just said, all right, you got 5 years to do this instead of 2, and I think they're hoping that reduces their workload on this.
Sure, a lot of paperwork involved, especially when you talk about the complexity of some people's property and ownership, for sure. So thank you for that update on that change. It's an important one for listeners to keep in mind, for sure. Let's move on to this next story that you've recently brought up, and it's one where it's an auto accident, but there was also an already dead animal in the road. Can you explain it a little more for us?
Yeah, this happened out in the Goodland, Kansas, 40, 50 miles inside the Kansas border, or actually a little bit less, or the Colorado border. This happened about 4 years ago. And you had a pickup truck that was westbound on I-70, headed from Indiana out to apparently Colorado. And the truck hit a deceased bull in the roadway. The bull had already been hit a couple of times, and it's laying in the roadway. And these people come upon it, testified that later, court case, they had their crew set at 80 miles per hour. They hit this bull in the night, and the pickup truck rolls. And they got injuries, and so there's a lawsuit back against the Kansas Department of Transportation as well as bull's owner. And a couple of principles come out of this. This case is not resolved. This is just a trial court opinion that said we're not going to grant a summary judgment motion. We're going to let this case go on to trial. Now, it was granted in part with respect to the Department of Transportation. And so the court said the Department of Transportation, their fence that they had up does not have to be a legal fence. It has to be a fence that restricts vehicular traffic to the interstate. And so they had no duty to build and maintain a fence to keep livestock off the interstate. And they didn't fail to remove the bull in a reasonable time after they were notified. And so the court said there weren't any fact issues with respect to the state's involvement in this. So the Department of Transportation's out. Then the question was whether the bull's owner could be dismissed from the case. And the rule in Kansas, and many of the listeners will know, is that a livestock owner in Kansas is not necessarily responsible for injuries or death that their animals cause if they escape their enclosures. The injured party has to prove that the livestock owner was negligent.
Well, you hinted at something key there, that's the law in Kansas, right? In other states, there's some variability on this sort of law.
Yeah, this is a different state to state. Many of the major livestock production states will protect the livestock industry with that type of a rule. There was a prominent case 25 years ago out of Nebraska where a theory known as res ipsa loquitur was used, and that basically flips the legal presumption around, and it says, well, you are presumed to be liable when your animals get out and cause injury or damage, unless you can prove that you weren't negligent, which is next to an impossible standard for a livestock owner. So most states, and Kansas included, does not follow that rule. But Nebraska has in the past. They've modified it a bit since then. But some states create a rebuttable presumption of negligence. There are a couple of states where you are liable as a livestock owner if your animals get out and cause injury. But Kansas is not that way. In Kansas, the injured party has to prove that you as the livestock owner were negligent somehow. In other words, you left the gate open, you knew you had, say, animals in heat that had been escaping, you knew that an animal was out and you did nothing to get it back in within a reasonable time, so forth and so on. So there has to be evidence that the injured party brings forth in order for the livestock owner to be held responsible.
Sure, and in this case specifically, the plaintiffs are claiming that the defendant failed to exercise that due care, that they were being negligent because they didn't fix a fence, a broken panel, and they didn't have no trespassing signs. Is that right?
And they also claim that there was an unknown trespasser on the property, and it was that trespasser that allegedly released the bull. So you got all these types of issues in controversy, or facts in controversy, including the maintenance of the fence and whether that broken panel was fixed and whether there should have been no trespassing signs. And ultimately the court said, well, there are facts that remain in dispute on the negligence issue. And this comparative fault issue of the driver going too fast is also an issue that the court said we're going to have a jury decide these issues. So while summary judgment was granted to the Department of Transportation, removing them from the case, the bull's owner was not removed from the case, and it proceeds to trial.
Well, definitely a complex case for sure, and one that it's always a good reminder for producers to make sure that they're keeping their fence lines intact and to know their rights as property owners and things of that nature. So, Roger, thank you again for this timely information.
Thanks, Samantha.
Once again, that was Roger McEowen. He is a K-State and Washburn University School of Law ag law expert with this week's Ag Law Update. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. Joining us now is K-State Southeastern Area agronomist Bruno Pedreira, covering the importance of soil testing for optimizing forage production specifically. And I was lucky enough to catch Bruno while attending the CARA Summer Field Days last week, which was hosted at K-State's North Agronomy Farm. And at that event, Bruno and numerous other K-State experts utilized the event to really speak about important issues such as water quality, corn and sorghum fertility, herbicide efficacy, and much more. But once again, luckily I was able to meet Bruno and invite him to record a segment on the show about the topic that he was really focusing on that week and what we will be covering today, which once again is the importance of soil testing.
Yeah. We were talking about, fertilizer prices are high at this point, but we need to keep growing our grass. Mm-hmm. We do have cows to feed, and we need to produce hay. We need to produce forage to feed our animals. And in that situation, soil test is a huge deal for us. And again, I like to remember you guys that we can have it with a, $750, $80 here in our soil and K-State Soil Lab. And that's a kind of tool that helps us tremendously. With a soil test, we can have an idea about what we have in the soil in terms of pH, phosphorus, and potash. And based on that, we can make decisions that will be smart decisions. That will be decisions that help us to program to create a fertility program to fertilize plants in order to obtain a desired plant response. So, that's the kind of thing that we do need.
Absolutely. And we're talking about this now specifically because, a lot of harvesting has been going on in terms of forage, and we've got even more to come up in terms of fescue to come. But we're talking about this ahead of time now to make sure that people are going out into their fields when there isn't anything in there and they can get good samples so they can prepare, really. Yeah.
Assuming that, especially for the fescue, we are going to apply P and K during the fall. That's not bad to go to the field in the next few weeks and take some soil samples, send to the lab, and be prepared to what is coming. So based on these soil samples, we can prepare our potash and phosphorus fertilization to late September, October, something like this, and know and prepare what are the targets for next year. And then when we got, in the late winter, early spring next year, when the fescue starts coming up, we will know how much nitrogen we need to apply in order to get that target. Mm-hmm. And that's one thing that I want to stress today here as well. When we are thinking about, assuming that we have the soil test, assuming we got these numbers and we can plan based on it, one of the things that is nice when you send your soil to the lab as well is to tell us what is the crop you are working with and what is your target. Mm-hmm. In our K-State spreadsheet, we have places to fill with this information, and I can put it there. That's a fescue, that's a new seeding fescue, that's a established fescue, and my target will be 4 tons per acre. And based on that, you get a recommendation, and that will be your main source to make decisions for the next growing season. So with all of it together, hopefully we're going to be able to deal with these high prices and get really nice yields out of our fields next year.
Absolutely. That specificity is key when we're thinking in terms of efficiency of production. Like you said, those costs are so high that we're wanting to maximize what producers are, sometimes blindly utilizing, but make sure that we're pinpointing exactly how much it might be, smaller amounts than they're used to.
Yes. Well, out of some data we have from our trials down in Parsons, we have numbers. For example, you can go from 3 or 5 pounds of forage producer for each dollar that you spend, and we have numbers like 45 pounds for each dollar that you spend. Wow. So it's really important to know what you have in the soil, what are your targets for your fields, and based on that, we are going to look for the best efficiency. I want to have the best amount of forage, the higher amount of forage I can for each dollar that I'm spending. Mm-hmm. So planning ahead, please. Make sure that you know where you are and where you're going. That's the main goal for the next season.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the importance of, those macronutrients, NPK, that we're commonly hearing about all the time. But pH is something that's also important in terms of planning ahead.
Yeah, sure. pH is a kind of thing that I'd like to talk about, and I don't think we have been talking the much we need in terms of forages. We assume that forages can grow with low pH, and that's true. We have native plants. Mm-hmm. We have our native predators with really low pH, and we have forage plants there. But if you want to have more out of your pasture, pH is the kind of thing that tell us about the chemical environment. pH tell us, how the nutrients will play into the soil. And most of the soil samples I've been discussing with the agents and the farmers, it's very common, especially in the southeast Kansas, we got numbers between 5, 5.2, 5.3. And those numbers are low, even for forages. And when we have pH in these ballpark, 5, 5.5, you see that the availability of the nutrients in the soil will be lower than when we have numbers, better than that. In this kind of acidic soil, the nutrients sometimes are there, but they are not plant available. Mm-hmm. And the use of, if you identify that the pH is low, we can use lime, which is widely available in Kansas. We can find it here. There was no great price change in the last year or so, different than what happened with NP and K. Mm-hmm. You guys are all seeing that. But if we can apply some lime and increase this pH for 6, 6.5, which would be the target for fescue and brome, for example, we'd like to say that in between 6 and 7 would be great for brome and fescue fields. If we are talking about alfalfa, for example, it needs to be higher than that, 6, 8, 7. But if we can go to 6 something, the nutrients that we have there, they will be more available for the plants. So before you spend money with NP and K, please go take soil samples, figure out what is the pH you have, and let's work with some lime before go and spend even more money with the other fertilizers.
Sure. In some ways, it's, working a little bit smarter instead of harder when it comes to utilizing your dollars. It's almost, why wouldn't you be doing this, really?
Yeah. That, and my point of view is, by the end of the day, that's all about efficient. Mm-hmm. If we can be more efficient, why we are not going to be? And ton of lime today costs like $8-9. Sometimes applied can cost more than that, obviously, but they are available. They are in Kansas. We should consider more. We should consider using more of these resources we have available around us.
Absolutely. And if producers are tuning in, they're like, oh, I'm inspired by this point. I need to get soil testing done. You've mentioned that K-State has a lab where they can directly send their samples. What is that process like?
Yeah. Well, if you Google K-State Soil Lab, you'll find it. And in Kansas, we are very well organized with these things. So if you go to your extension office in your county, all of your ag agents, they know how to do it. Most of our extension offices, they have the probe, the soil core to borrow to you, so they are there and they are able to help you to go out and guide you in how you can take the soil samples, send to us here in Manhattan, and we will be able to give you a really nice recommendation to go for and be efficient with your soil results.
Excellent. Well, in terms of other resources that producers may be interested in looking into on this subject, what are some of those?
Well, we have some materials available, but I would encourage them to talk with our extension agents. Mm-hmm. They are all being trained by us. And in days like we had this week, the career school, most of our agents were here being updated, and they know more how to do it every single day. They are being exposed with all of the results we get out of our research centers and main campus here as well. So I would encourage you to talk with your agent and how you can do to improve your forage systems, and they will get you on the right place.
Absolutely. Well, Bruno, as always, we'll link all those resources in the show notes of today's page, which can be found on agtoday.net. But Bruno, thank you so much for your time.
Well, I appreciate it and glad to be here. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Once again, that was Bruno Pedreira. He is the Southeast area agronomist here at K-State, and he was covering the importance of soil testing. Before we cut to a short break, I just wanted to preview what you listeners can expect to hear from Agriculture Today and the rest of the coming week. And that starts with tomorrow. We will be speaking with K-State Professor of Agricultural Economics and the Director of the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for collaborative research on sorghum and millet, Tim Dalton. He will be sharing with us one of his latest research studies that has looked at the global economic impact of agricultural research and the return on investment seen from research carried out at universities like K-State and other land-grant university programs over the course of approximately 40 years. This week, we will also have with us K-State watershed specialist Ron Graber. He will be speaking with us about water quality and how it is related to livestock for this week's water segment. Once again, we will be cutting to a short break here in a moment, but when we return, we will be back with this week's Beef Cattle Institute's Ask the Experts, where Brad White, Brian Lubbers, Dustin Pendell, and Phillip Lancaster will answer your latest beef cattle question. We will be back with that and more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We end our Wednesday programming with our weekly Beef Cattle Institute's Ask the Experts segment. Ahead is the latest from that team.
Welcome to Beef Cattle Institute's Ask the Experts. We've got some good experts here today that are going to be able to answer a question. Our format for this is a little bit different. We're going to have about 5 minutes that we're going to be able to answer questions as we go through, and then each answer will be given a point value at the end of it. So I've got my three experts are Dr. Brian Lubbers, who does food animal therapeutics.
Hello.
Dr. Dustin Pendell, who does ag economics.
Hello.
And Dr. Phillip Lancaster, who's a beef nutritionist.
Hello.
So our question for today, guys, that came from a listener, and if you'd like to send us a question, you can email us at bci@ksu.edu. Our question today is, where would you like to see the most genetic improvements in the beef industry? Brian, you're up first.
So we know, because there's been a fair bit of research in this area, that the heritability is low. But for me, I would like to see it in animal health. And we can talk about a couple diseases, but for beef cattle, our number one disease challenge is bovine respiratory disease. So I think if we can make some genetic improvements as far as increasing the animal's resistance to disease for respiratory, we would see some pretty significant economic benefit and welfare benefits as well. So I'll go with animal health. Because I'm in the animal health, I think that's a good answer. So I'd give you 7 points for that. Dustin?
So when I first saw this question, my initial thought was diseases is what I was going to say, something related to animal diseases. So I guess, that's kind of copying what Brian did. So I don't know, does that mean I get...
You're going to have less points for that.
7 minus something or another, divided by 2 or something. Do we split those points, I guess? Is that how that works?
Exactly.
No, I guess as economists that studies a lot of the animal health, animal diseases, I mean, that's where I guess it's more specific than just the beef industry in general, thinking about other species as well, whether high path AI or some of these other transboundary diseases. If we could somehow, work on the genetics so we don't see these diseases that have impact on lots of producers and everybody throughout the entire supply chain.
Yep, absolutely. And I think good answer there, Dustin, but you did lose a point for copying off Brian. You only got 6. Phillip?
So I'm going to take a little different approach, looking at something that is fairly highly heritable that we think of as body size and maintenance energy requirements. We know there's variation that has a lot to do with body size in cows, but we also know that there's variation within animals of the same body size. So we have not found a good way to select for this yet, and so I think that is a important area of genetic improvement, because that maintenance cost of that cow accounts for 50% of the feed to produce 1 pound of beef. And so we really need to make some improvement in that to improve the efficiency and sustainability of our beef production system.
Excellent. Phillip has the really good answer because his is doable. We know carcass-related traits are highly heritable and makes a big economic difference. So I'm going to give him 9 points. Brian, Dustin, and Phillip, you each have 15 seconds to respond or give any final thoughts.
So although health's really important, I do think the production traits, you're right, it's more doable, right? So we know from research that health, like you said, we've struggled with that for a long, long time, and we haven't made significant strides there. So if I was going to do something that was actionable today, I probably would change my answer to Phillips if I can get a few more points.
A bonus point for changing your answer, but then you lose one on your original answer, so you're even. Dustin?
You asked us what we would like to see in the future. I mean, we're talking about, Phillip said something that, we can probably do it soon, but let's shoot for the sky. Let's go big. Go big or go home. So why would we want to do something like production?
I like it. I like your boldness. I'm going to give Dustin 2 points for that. Phillip, you got to score a point here to stay ahead.
Well, I think from the technologies that we're really developing, I think there's a lot of potential to improve genetics of animal health from the genomic side. It's hard to measure, and so we have a very little ability in our natural production system to look at the genetics of animal health and to make selection. But with genomics, I think we have a lot of potential to make some improvement there.
Excellent. Thanks, Phillip. And Phillip wins the day. And thanks for your questions. You can always email us more at bci@ksu.edu.
Once again, that was Brad White, Brian Lubbers, Dustin Pendell, and Phillip Lancaster, all experts from K-State's Beef Cattle Institute. That concludes today's programming. For Agriculture Today, I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network.